Tonight we're going to talk about weaning strategies and feeding considerations. So when we think about weaning cattle, the first thing I really want to talk about is some terminology, because weaning and early weaning can mean different things to different people. So generally when we think about weaning, we would think about what I would describe as traditional weaning of those calves at typically 6 to 8 months of age. There's also situations where we may look at weaning 1 to 2 months earlier than normal to save body condition on those cows or improve body condition scores, or maybe to save a little bit of forage. So not traditional weaning, but not technically early weaning either. We're just weaning a month or two earlier than what we would normally do. And then we have what I would describe as classical early weaning. And when we think about this, we're actually thinking about weaning those calves at 45 to 60 days of age. And we're doing that for immediate reproductive benefits on those cows. So if we have cows that are too thin, they're not going to cycle the way they need to after calving. So we can actually go in there and wean those calves at 45 to 60 days of age and stimulate those cows to go ahead and start cycling so we can get them bred back and maintain roughly that yearly calving interval. So those are going to be the three different types of weaning, at least that I'm going to talk about. We're going to focus on traditional weaning tonight at 6 to 8 months of age, but we will talk about the other two just a little bit. But just realize when I say early weaning, I'm talking weaning really young calves at 45 to 60 days of age. And yes, we can do that. And if we do it correctly, those calves perform very well and they can be very efficient at that point in time. What would be some of the goals of a weaning program? Well, with weaning, what we're really trying to do is prepare calves to perform as stockers, as feeders, or if we're keeping them as replacement heifers. We're looking to reduce health problems in those animals and increase performance. And then by weaning those cattle that would be sold as stockers or feeders, we're looking at trying to increase their value, because there is a premium if we market those cattle correctly by having them weaned. Just quickly, and you're going to see this slide again when we get into the nutrition section. That's how important I think it is we're going to look at it twice tonight. But when we think about goals during the weaning program, we're looking at trying to keep those calves growing at a moderate rate. I really am not trying to get them to grow real fast. 3/4 of a pound to 1.5 pounds a day works well to keep that immune system functioning and keeping those calves moving in the right direction. We're looking to try to keep costs down. If we spend too much money in our weaning program, we're not going to benefit from those premiums we receive for weaning those calves. We want to make sure we keep that rumen healthy, and then we want to optimize that immune function. So what are some factors that would affect weaning age on cattle? One of them is going to be cow body condition score, and that's a big one. So anytime those cows start getting less than a body condition score of 4, we want to look at weaning those calves earlier, whether that's a month or 2 months or maybe even 3 months earlier than normal, so that we can maintain that body condition on those cows and give them a chance to regain the proper amount of body condition before they need to calve again. It's much easier to go ahead and pull that calf off and try to get that condition back on that cow that way, rather than trying to feed the cow-calf pair together. So just kind of as a recap, when we think about body condition score, we're talking about scoring those cows from a body condition score 1 to a body condition score 9, with 5 being kind of in the middle. What we would see on those body condition score 4 cows is typically you'll see the last couple ribs. If we look at the transverse spinous processes, we can't count them, but there's a thin shelf there that needs to fill back in with muscle. From hooks to pins, we've lost some muscle, and that pin bone's pretty prominent. That's looking at a Bos indicus cross cow without any hair. We got to make sure if we're looking at one with hair like this heifer here, you look a little closer. We can still see those ribs. We still see that thin shelf there at that transverse spinous process. The hook bone's very prominent, and you see we actually have lost some muscle tissue between hooks and pins there. Why spend the time talking about body condition? Because body condition is the biggest driver of pregnancy rates in our cow herd. If we look at body condition score at calving, and this is a study out of the University of Florida, but all studies that have been published show the same pattern. If we look at pregnancy rates on the vertical axis and we look at body condition score, you can see the low body condition scores. Those cows just aren't getting bred up very well. As we increase body condition score, we're going to increase pregnancy rates. When we move from a 5 to a 6, we really don't see much jump at that point in time. So what that tells us is for mature cows, and for the purposes of this discussion, I would consider a mature cow to be 4 years of age or older. I want those cows in at least a body condition score of 5 or greater just before or at calving. Now, if they get higher than that, just because we have good forage conditions and a good grazing program, that's great. We're just probably not going to try to feed them to get them any higher than a 5, but we want them at least a 5, if not higher. If we're talking about 2 and 3 year old females, I would want those to be in a body condition score of 6 or greater just prior to calving. So that's why we look at that body condition score on that cow to help us identify if we need to look at changing our weaning time frame on those animals. The flip side of that, let's say we have great forage condition, those cows are in really good shape. We could actually let those calves nurse a month or 2 longer than what we would traditionally do. But we need to make sure we wean those calves at least 60 to 90 days before calving so that we have time for that cow to let her udder recover and for her to start producing that colostrum that next calf's going to need at birth. So good forage condition, cows in good body condition. Maybe we wait till those calves are 8, 9, 9.5 months of age, definitely no longer than about 10 months of age, so that we let that cow produce that colostrum for the next calf. Some other factors that would affect when we think about weaning is, what is our marketing plan? Are we participating in a preconditioned calf sale? If so, they're going to have a set date prior to the sale date that we need to have those calves weaned by. Now, most of those will require at least a 45-day weaning period. We're starting to see that increase to 60 days on more and more sales. So just check and see if you're thinking about a preconditioned calf sale, whether it's 45 or 60 days. Maybe everything's going good. We don't have a set date we have to wean from a marketing standpoint, but we just look at weaning at that traditional 6 to 8 months of age we were thinking about, or we were talking about earlier. Or maybe there's a calendar date for whatever reason you want to make sure you have those calves weaned by that day. Some other factors that would affect weaning time is, what if we're in a drought? Unfortunately, in East Texas, we're still looking pretty good, but as you get into West Texas, you get into New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, Nevada, they're experiencing a tremendous amount of drought right now. So if we're in a situation like that, we may look at weaning those calves at 3 to 6 months of age just to save some forage or save that cow condition. It's a whole lot cheaper to pull that calf off and save that condition on that cow rather than keep that calf on for another 60 or 90 days and really pull that cow down and have to try to feed her back into condition. So if we're in drought conditions, or just maybe we have some cows that were not in drought, but for whatever reason, they're not quite in the condition we would want, we could look at weaning that calf off that cow a month or 2 early to let her gain some weight back before she gets ready to calve again. The other thing we would think about is if we need to wean because those animals are thin from a reproductive standpoint. So if we've been in a long-term drought, we may be dealing with cows, and those cows just aren't in the condition we need them to be when they calve. So we look at weaning those calves at about 60 days of age, 45 to 60 days of age, to make sure we can let that cow cycle back. So if you think about, we need to have those cows bred back within 80 days of calving to maintain a yearly calving interval. If we're going to stimulate them to go ahead and cycle by weaning that calf, we need to do that a few weeks before that to allow time for that physiological change to occur there. So that's why I say 45, but at least by about 60 days after calving. Some people, if they've had a challenge with getting first calf cows bred back, they may look at weaning those calves at 45 to 60 days of age. Generally, if we've developed those heifers properly and we have a good forage program in place, that's not necessary. But those would be the two most common situations when we would look at a true early weaning situation. What are some of the benefits of weaning those calves? Well, we should see reduced health problems in them, improved performance, improved market timing. What I mean by improved market timing, and let's say we're kind of a late winter, spring calving operation, and we would typically look at selling those calves September, October timeframe. Well, if we wean them for 60 days and then sell them, now we're looking at November, December, and traditionally speaking, that market actually starts to come back up a little bit as we get out of September and October for those 500 and 600 pound type calves. The reason being is just supply and demand. We have so many of them coming to market in September and October. By delaying that market timing a little bit, sometimes we can that market will come back up for us a little bit. One of the huge ones, and probably we don't talk about it enough and we don't think about it enough as far as how it impacts income in our operation, is going to be reducing shrink. Those calves that are weaned will not walk as much. When we take them to market, they're not going to shrink as much, which has a huge impact on the income we generate from them. And then if we market them in a special preconditioned calf sale, we can see some increased value by weaning those calves. Talking about that shrink a little bit more, if we were to look at an unweaned calf and just taking it to a local auction market, it would be very common for those calves to shrink 8 to 12%. So let's just say those calves shrunk 10%. On a 500 pound calf, 10% is 50 pounds that I no longer have to sell on that calf. So anything we can do to reduce shrink is going to be in our favor. So some of those things we can do is we want to wean those calves for at least 45 days. When we go to gather those calves, we want to reduce stress as much as possible when we're pinning them and when we're loading them. We want to minimize the amount of time between gathering and when those animals are weighed. And we want to, in some situations, maybe get cattle in early so they have time to fill back up before they weigh them. So, for example, if you were to take calves to the net bio sale in Sulphur Springs, that sale is on a Wednesday. They'll typically start weighing calves up on Friday. You may want to look at actually taking them in the week before on a Wednesday, so they would have 2 days on feed. So all the weight they lost during transportation, they would actually fill back up before those animals got weighed again. So that's something to think about. And if you are looking at that, you want to get them in there at least 24 hours before they weigh them. 48 works real well. There's no reason to get them in any earlier than that. So what are some methods when we think about weaning calves? Well, one of the most common ones, definitely not the best, but very common, is weaning them on a trailer, meaning we pull them right off the cow and take them to an auction market and sell them. If you are going to do that, just make sure you minimize the amount of time between when those animals are sold and when you separate them from the cow. That's going to be better on the calf in several ways, and it's going to help you out from a shrink standpoint. A lot of people like weaning calves in a corral. And there's two different ways you could go about doing that. You could put the calf in the corral, which is probably the most common, and the cows out on pasture somewhere, or you could put the cows in the corral. If you're going to use a corral to wean, I actually like putting the cows in the corral better. The reason being is since those animals are going to be a little more compact, we're likely to see some more dust in that environment, those cows will actually handle that better than what the calves are. So if that's what you're looking at, you may want to consider that. Weaning in the pasture. So we put the cows in one pasture and we skip a couple pastures and put the cows in another pasture is a method some people will use. It's not one that people end up using year after year a lot of times, because what ends up happening in that situation is even though you have a pasture in between where the cows are and the calves are, those cows a lot of times will go through the fence trying to get back to the calves. So just be aware of that if that is a strategy you're thinking about using. There are mechanical weaning devices that you can actually put in the nose that will prevent those calves from suckling. A little more labor involved with this situation. Some people like it, other people don't like that situation as well. If you are going to use some kind of a mechanical weaning device, make sure you don't leave that in there too long because it will cause some irritation to the nasal lining, and that's something we want to avoid. So if you're going to do that, typically 4 to 5 days is what you would be looking at in that situation. Now, don't think if I put that mechanical weaning device in there for 4 to 5 days and that calf doesn't suck, that I can take it out and leave that calf with the cow. Those calves will go back to sucking. So we're going to need to go ahead and still separate them. So you're just kind of doing a two-stage process. So you take the milk away from them initially, and then you separate them. To me, I think separation is probably the biggest impact on them. So that's not a strategy I personally use, but there are some people who do like that strategy. The one I like the best is what we call fence line weaning. And with fence line weaning, we're going to have the cows on one side of the fence and we're going to have the calves on the other side of the fence. And what works well about this is those cows and calves can hear and see each other, so that will reduce how much they walk the fence, how much bellowing there is. Now, when it comes to fence line weaning, what kind of fence do you need? Well, obviously, a pipe fence between them works great. Net wire fence works well. We're seeing more and more net wire go up due to the feral hog issue. If you are thinking about replacing a fence, that may be something you want to look at. High tensile net wire can be very, very cost effective when you actually sit down and run the numbers on it. You can fence line wean on a good barbed wire fence. You can actually do it on a pretty poor barbed wire fence. When I was in grad school at Oklahoma State, the fence we typically weaned on was an old barbed wire fence that the cedar posts were to the point you couldn't put a new staple back in them or a new nail back in them, so you had to take some baling wire and tie it up. Now, in that situation, you may have a calf or two that cross through the fence. Not a big deal. Don't get frustrated with that. Just take that calf and separate it back out. You don't have to do it immediately. You may wait a day or two in case another one crawls through and then separate them back out. And if you have a calf that keeps crawling through on a poor fence, you may look at taking that one calf or the one or two calves and putting them in a corral. The other thing you can do is take an electric fence, and one strand of electric along that fence that's not so great does a great job in keeping those calves where you want them. I'll tell you personally, on our family operation, the fence we wean on is a 6-strand smooth wire fence. I didn't build that fence. That fence was already there when we purchased the place, but the reason we use that is it's the best location when we think about shade and water resources and those kind of things. I've never had a calf grow through the fence or a cow go through the fence since I put the one strand of electric on it. Before that, we may have one or two calves that occasionally crawl through, but not a big deal. You can, in smaller operations with really gentle calves, you can wean on just a straight electric fence. That's not something I would typically recommend, but if you know your animals well, and especially if you're dealing with older calves, that may be an option. I go through all that to let you know you don't have to have the best fence in the world to do fence line weaning. The keys with fence line weaning is you need to make sure you get those animals separated out in a very calm and quiet manner. If we get the cows and the calves real wound up when we're separating them, then it just doesn't work as well. So when we think about tips for success from a weaning standpoint, we want to pay attention to the environment. We want to try avoiding putting those calves in a dusty environment. We want to make sure those calves are going to have good access to shade, especially if you're weaning fall-born calves that were born late September, October, November. You're weaning those calves in May or June. You want to make sure you have shade. In most parts of Texas, when we get into September and October, it can still be plenty hot. So even on those late winter spring-born calves, make sure you have good shade for those calves. Want to try to avoid putting them in a muddy environment, and if you can, and then you want to avoid animal crowding. So really like doing it out on a pasture with that fence line weaning. The other thing we want to make sure we do is perform any health management practices, most of those prior to weaning. When it comes to vaccination, we may actually do one round after weaning. But we don't want to get in there and castrate and vaccinate and dehorn and wean all on the same day. That's just too stressful on those calves, and they're not going to perform as well in that situation. So that castration, we want to get it done typically before about 3 months of age. Oftentimes we'll get that first round of vaccine in those calves at 2 to 3 months of age, get them dehorned early as well, or preferably if you can use some polled genetics, just take the horns off of them through using homozygous polled bulls or polled bulls. Nothing wrong with giving one round of vaccine prior to weaning, letting those calves wean for 7 to 10 days, and then come in with that booster vaccine if you want. That works really well. So what I'm getting at there is all we really want to do on the day we wean those calves is separate the cows from the calves. If we can help it, we don't want to do any other management practices. If you can't and you have to, well then go ahead and do them. But the ideal scenario is just wean the cows and the calves on that day. So I mentioned calm and quiet, and this is a huge one, is the easier you are about separating the cows from the calves, the better off you're going to be. This set of calves you see here in the picture, you see a couple of them laying down here. You can see by pasture conditions, this was a pretty darn dry year. Not the best fence in the world. This picture here was taken of those calves within 30 minutes of them being separated from the cows. Notice they're not up there walking the fence immediately. That's because they were separated in a very calm and quiet manner, so they went ahead and went to grazing like they were used to. If you get them real stirred up, you're going to have more problems out of it. So the calmer and simpler you can go about separating them out, the better off you're going to be. And that's going to be regardless of what you use, but especially with fence line weaning, it makes a big difference. A lot of people worry about calves losing weight, especially early on in the weaning process. If you fence line wean them, you have a good forage program, or if we're in a really dry year, we can supplement them. Those calves won't ever back up. They'll just keep right on going and gaining. Where we see that drop in performance is when we really stress those calves out during the weaning process. Think about that environment. You are going to have some walking, even when you do things well, and some bellowing. So we want to make sure, especially on the side of the fence where the calves are going to be, we have good shade for those calves to get into, where they're not walking out there in the heat of the sun. That's just going to add additional stress to the process. Make sure they have access to good drinking water and easy access. So whether that's a water trough, or that's a pond or a creek or a river, I just want to make sure they don't have to go too far to that water source. Preferably, I'd like to have it within a couple 100 yards of the fence. Another thing you want to think about is from a pasture selection standpoint, you don't want a really big pasture. Anywhere from 5 to 20 acres works really well. You don't want to wean those calves in a pasture that's several hundred acres. I realize we don't have really any of those in East Texas, but if you are running some cattle or having some friends running some cattle out west or in some north central area of the United States, some of those pastures get really big. That's not what we're looking for. We need a pasture that we can kind of keep those calves confined in, where they have some space to spread out, but they don't have several hundred acres to spread out, so that we can check them in that situation. So again, 5 to 20 acres works really well for a weaning pasture. We want to train those calves to eat prior to weaning them. This really doesn't take that much time and that much expense. I'll tell you from experience, typically in most operations, after feeding the calves and the cows together, those calves will know what that feed bunk is after about 3 to 4 feedings. 15 years ago, I would have told you I would have thought it took longer, but I'll just tell you from personal experience, over the years, we used to start at 2 weeks before and feed those pairs every day, and I just gradually reduced that down over time, and typically now in about 3 to 4 feedings before weaning and those calves are trained. The other thing is I'll tell you is they do remember what that feed bunk is. So let's say we had some reason we were having to feed them when those calves were only 2 to 3 months of age, and then we didn't wean them till they were 6 to 8. If they were used to seeing feed eating alongside their dam at that point in time, they do remember that really well. But a little bit of feed prior to weaning really helps get those calves eating better once we do wean. So what are some specific nutrition considerations we think about? So again, not looking at maximizing gain, and I'll show you part of the reason why on that here in a minute. But anywhere between 3/4 of a pound and a pound and a half a day works great. We need to keep those costs down, so that means we want to try to do it on grass. We want to keep that rumen healthy, so that means we need to think about energy supplements and their risk of acidosis and hand feeding versus self-feeding options, and then we really want to look at improving that immune function. So one of the things I want to talk about, and the reason in most situations we're not trying to get those calves to gain 2 pounds or 3 pounds a day, is because of value of gain. And what is value of gain? That's just what is each additional pound of weight gain we put on that calf from feeding, what is it worth? So the way you kind of want to think about this is you may look at last year's prices for different weights of calves, and then we can calculate this value of gain. So actually looking at some prices from fall of 2019 from the same sale on the same day. Look at a 500-pound steer bringing $1.45 a pound. So his value per head is $725. Let's just say we wean those calves for 60 days. We put 2 pounds of weight gain on them. So we were supplementing them a fair bit to get them to gain that. 620-pound steer bringing $1.32. So he's worth $818.40. So now the question is, well, each additional pound of weight I put on him, is it worth $1.45? Is it worth $1.32? Or is it worth something less than that? And the answer is it's worth something less than that. And the way we figure that is we change the weight of that animal by 120 pounds. So 620 minus 500 is 120 pounds difference in weight. What do we change the value per head of that calf? So the 620 was $818.40 minus 725. We change value by $93.40. So now we can take that change in value of $93.40, divide it by the change in weight of 120, and that tells us each additional pound of weight we put on that calf from a feeding standpoint is only worth 78 cents. So if it costs me more than 78 cents to put that weight on, I'm losing money in that situation. So let's just say the feed we're using, and if you're buying feed, most of that feed, you're probably looking at somewhere between 8 and 10 pounds of feed to get 1 pound of weight gain. So let's just say that feed was costing us 12 cents a pound. Well, at 8 pounds times 12 cents, that's 96 cents I spent to get that extra pound of weight, and that extra pound of weight gain was only worth 78 cents. So I'm losing money in that situation. So that's why we really want to try to do as much of this on grass, and we want to keep those weights lower when we go to sell those calves. The other thing, another reason we don't want to get those calves real fat by putting on a lot of weight gain is when they're fat, they're actually going to get discounted by those buyers. Those buyers want those calves to be in kind of just a moderate condition. They don't want them real fat and fleshy. You will typically see a discount in that situation. So we need to think about value of gain when we're feeding those calves, and we also need to think about if we do get them too fleshy, what impact that may have on prices. If you're interested on value of gain and looking at that in a little more detail, I do have a spreadsheet that we put on the beef.tamu.edu website. If you'll go down to the section that says spreadsheets, there'll be one on value of gain where you can actually plug numbers in and look at that. Historically, value of gain is going to run somewhere between 75 and about 85 cents. Another way to kind of think about this is think about your buying power on feed versus the buying power a feedlot has. Feedlot's definitely going to be able to buy that feed cheaper. They're not going to pay you to put extra weight gain on that calf if they can do it at a cheaper manner. So typically, if we see the price of corn get really high, then value of gain actually increases, and that's telling us as cow-calf producers or stocker operators, the feedlots want us to put more weight on those animals through a grazing program. When corn gets really, really cheap, value of gain goes down even more. That's the feedlot saying, hey, we have cheap corn. We would rather buy those calves at a lighter weight and put more weight on them in the feedlot. Just kind of remember, typically we're between about 75 and 85 cents on that value of gain. So when we think about weaning those calves, I already emphasized we want to do it with a good forage program. One of the things we are going to supply those calves during that weaning phase is access to a good free choice mineral supplement. Typically, we're looking at a loose mineral supplement in that said situation. If you have access to a mineral tub that's formulated well, you could use that as well. Realize with those tubs, they're going to cost a little bit more for the same amount of nutrition as what a loose mineral will. So make sure we have those calves have access to a good free choice mineral supplement. We want to make sure we plan our grazing program so that we have high quality pasture available at the location or the facility where we want to wean. So you have to think a couple months out, how are we going to rotate through pastures and how can we make sure where we're going to wean those calves is a pasture that has some high quality forage available for it. Already mentioned about making sure the pasture is not too large. We want to think about that 5 to 20 acres. Works well in a lot of situations. We can actually wean calves on stockpiled Bermuda grass and Bahia grass. So if we were to go in there and get that hayed off or grazed off the first part of September or late August, depending on where we're located at, apply about 50 to 60 pounds of actual nitrogen, let it grow to first frost. Then we can put those calves on it and they'll gain pretty well on that stockpiled forage. And the reason they will is if we look at, this is some work out of Overton looking at digestibility of Bermuda grass, common and coastal as well as Bahia grass. You can see quality is good. In the spring, we get in the heat of the summer, the quality goes down. Fall, quality goes back up because the temperatures are going down. That plant will actually deposit less lignin at those cooler temperatures, improving digestibility. Quality hangs on until we start grazing, and as they graze the better parts of it, the quality is going to go down. So if we can let them be selective in their grazing that stockpile forage, we can still see those calves do all right. Maybe we use stockpile forage or just a little bit of protein supplement in that situation. So what would be some general feeding guidelines? If those animals were grazing high quality pasture, we're only really going to look at feeding them to, if we're looking at improving gains, because we can provide just a little bit of feed and get a good efficiency there. Or more often than not, we're just teaching them how to eat so that they'll qualify for the requirements of a preconditioned calf cell. So in that situation, we're looking at feeding 1 to 2 pounds of an energy supplement per head in those situations. If we're just teaching them how to eat, we may only feed them for a week. And once they're eating good, if we have good quality pasture, just let them stay on the pasture, not give them anything other than that loose mineral supplement. If we're dealing with medium or low quality pasture, then we want to look at feeding a protein supplement. And by doing that, that'll increase intake and digestibility of that forage. Feeding a pound to a pound and a half of a high protein supplement works well in that situation. Cottonseed meal is probably the most common one we're going to use for those calves. We can wean on hay if we need to. Obviously, there's a little more cost associated with that. If we're on high quality hay, we're only going to supplement again to improve gains or teach those calves to eat. Again, looking at 1 to 3 pounds of an energy supplement per head per day. Now, when we think about feeding, I'm going to tell you for calves, especially around weaning, I greatly prefer hand feeding over some kind of a self-fed situation. What we worry about in a self-fed situation is some of those calves consuming too much feed too quick. We get some subacute acidosis or some acidosis, which leads to founder or liver abscesses. Neither one of those are going to be good. If you are going to be looking at some kind of a self-fed situation, definitely want to think about getting some cottonseed hulls or something like that in there to help buffer that rumen and make sure that a limiter is being used and that it's being used appropriately. The nice thing about hand feeding is we can control how much we put out there and gradually step those cattle up as they start to eat better. So it just takes some risk out of the equation for us. The other thing it does is it saves us a little bit of money there because it does require a little more labor, but the feed's going to be a little cheaper than if we were using a limiter with some type of a free choice feed in those situations. I personally really like starting cattle on a high protein supplement. My starting feed of choice is going to be cottonseed meal. The reason being is cottonseed meal is very palatable, and when we deal with high protein supplements like cottonseed meal, soybean meal, or a all natural 38 or 40% cube, is if we have one calf that eats way more than his share because it is a high protein supplement, we just don't see those same risk of the subacute acidosis and acidosis like we would with the textured feed or some of our commodities. So really like using a high protein supplement on those calves to get them started, or even if I'm just training them to eat for a little while. Cottonseed meal works really well. If you have bunks where you can use cottonseed meal, that's going to be preferable to cubes. Those big cubes, the calves just don't take to them as well. It takes them a little longer before they'll start eating them. If you have to feed on the ground, though, you're going to be looking at a cube in that situation. If we are talking about true early weaning, where we're dealing with those 45 to 60-day-old calves, there's definitely going to be some different feeding considerations. Rather than going through those tonight because they can get very specific, if you get in a situation where you're dealing with those calves, give me a call, get in contact with another ruminant nutritionist, and we can walk you through some options at that point in time. Those calves, if we feed them right, will actually perform very well. We can actually get those really young calves to gain a few pounds a day and do it in a very efficient manner. So if we're in a drought where we need to do that, that's always an option. If you're curious what the pictures are, this is just kind of a reminder and an illustration of why we have to handle those calves differently. This is showing you differences in the rumen and the reticulum depending on what those animals were on during the first 6 weeks of life. Milk only, you see no real development of rumen papillae and very limited musculature of the rumen. If they're on hay, got a little bit more development, but actually early on in those really young calves, grain actually helps that rumen develop. And then once we get the rumen developed, then we have to really pay attention on how we feed them. That's part of the reason why we have to handle those 45 to 60-day-old calves differently. Some other things we want to think about is marketing those weaned calves. So realize if you take those weaned calves just to your local weekly auction, you're probably not going to see that premium for them being weaned. What you will see an advantage on, though, is those calves aren't going to shrink as much, so there's still an advantage to weaning those calves even in that situation. Plus, it's the right thing for the long-term health of that calf. It's just the right thing to do for the industry. To maximize the value of those calves that have been weaned and vaccinated, we want to sell them in a special preconditioned calf sale. The longest running one, and probably the biggest one in Texas, is going to be the net bio sale at Sulphur Springs when we're talking about a commingled calf sale. Jordan Cattle Company out at San Saba is another one that's been around for many, many years. And then over the last 5 years, I actually starting to see more and more auction markets starting to include some preconditioned calf sales. You want to make sure, though, that preconditioned calf sale has a good reputation and they do have enough calves that they're going to sell to get the right kind of buyers in there, because we do see a different buyer for that preconditioned calf that's been weaned and vaccinated than we do that calf that's unweaned and we don't know any kind of vaccination history on it. We can market those calves if you can market in truckload lots through Superior or video auction, and definitely get the premium for weaning those calves in that situation. You may be able to sell them directly off the farm to somebody if that buyer has a market for those preconditioned calves. So just make sure if we wean them and vaccinate them, we market them in an opportunity that allows us to capture that value. And with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions anybody has on weaning strategies or feeding considerations on calves. So feel free to type those in the chat box or go ahead and unmute and ask those.
Dr. Banta.
Yes, sir, Vince.
Are you familiar with marketing through cattlerange.com?
Yes, I am. Do you have a specific question or just in general what my thoughts are?
Just in general. I heard about it for the first time about a week ago.
Okay, so cattlerange.com, for those of you who may not be familiar with it, is a website. Basically, it's a giant classified ad for cattle where you can post cattle on there with descriptions, pictures, contact information. There's no commission until you sell those calves. So if you don't sell those animals through Cattle Range, you don't pay a commission on them. If you do, there is a small commission. It's going to vary depending on what you sell and how many, but typically you're looking at somewhere between $8 and $12 per head in that situation. I would tell you, for selling breeding stock, replacement females, even bulls, it's a great option. I don't think it works as well for selling calves. You'll see a few of them occasionally listed, but I just don't see a whole lot of them sold there. So for any kind of replacement heifers or breeding stocks, great option. I think there's probably other options that work better when we're talking about weaned calves or unweaned calves. Okay. A couple questions did come in from the chat, so I'm going to read those and then I'll answer them. So if you have 600-pound steers with medium quality pasture, what would I supplement them with? I would look at roughly a pound of cottonseed meal per head per day. Watch the manure patties. If the manure patties are still stacking up after feeding that for 3 to 5 days, bump that amount up a little bit. If those manure patties get pretty loose, you can actually cut that amount back and only maybe do half a pound or 3/4 of a pound per head per day. But a pound of cottonseed meal per head per day is a great place to start. Once you get those calves eating consistently with that cottonseed meal, and we can only really do it with cottonseed meal, soybean meal, or 1 or 2 other feeds, not with most feeds, you could actually go to feeding every other day in that situation, or even potentially twice a week. So let's say we're feeding a pound of cottonseed meal per head per day. That's 7 pounds per week. I could actually break that up into 2 feedings of 3.5 pounds per feeding, or just 2 pounds every other day. But cottonseed meal would definitely be my go-to option on those 600-pound steers on medium quality forage, and just watch those manure patties. All right, well, if there's no other questions, we'll go ahead and wrap up tonight, and hope everybody has a good evening. And